Still with us? Great. That's a very energetic response. I feel like this has been very content-rich 2 days, so at least myself, I'm kind of at capacity, so a particular appreciation to you, to being here with us, and also those online. I think they have been having even a tougher job to stay in front of a screen and still engage with that steady supply of Swedish strong coffee. So good afternoon, my name is Johanna Poutanen. I'm from CMI, Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, and I really have the privilege to moderate today's discussion. Early warning in action, leveraging data and technology for violence prevention. And I have to confess here between friends that I feel a little bit of pressure when it comes to this panel, because over the past 2 days, there have been a number of comments and remarks made about this persisting gap between warning and action. And still kind of like, why isn't there? There's great technology, better analysis, better forecasting, and there still isn't that early action. So we have to crack that nut here in this panel, so no pressure at all to our panelists. But before we begin, just one clarification. I think the composition here in this panel does not mean to imply that governments are the only ones taking early action. There is a range of actors from local authorities, local communities. I myself come from civil society organizations engaged in dialogue and mediation, also a means of early action. But we thought that it's also useful to have a deliberate deep dive into one particular perspective. So how ministries and public institutions think about the challenge of translating warning into action. And also because this is a Nordic edition of the conference, so there's a focus on Europe or Northern Europe, but that also provides a basis of comparability, just to understand, maybe if not completely solving the challenge, understanding where we're making progress, what are the key persisting challenges and the like. So to introduce our wonderful panel, I'm here with Dr. Marius Hoffmann, who is a desk officer for crisis early warning at the German Federal Foreign Office. And sitting next to Aurora Bergmeier, who is a policy officer for early warning and conflict prevention at the European External Action Service. Then we have Fraser Alcorn, conflict analysis lead at the United Kingdom Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and Dr. Olli Ruohomäki, senior advisor at Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with a bit of a lightning opening round, because we want to have a conversation. So let's start with some misconceptions and realities. I'd like to ask you to clarify one, potentially a misconception or unjustified generalization. Is there something about data early warning or violence prevention that you think that we as a sector or the public is generally getting wrong or somehow misunderstanding? Marius, do you want to start?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks also to the organizers. I'm here on behalf of a small team of data scientists in the GFFO. Our former name was Preview, Predict, Visualize, Early Warning. That name is not correct anymore since we are getting restructured. When I started at the GFFO about 3 years ago, I thought I would do like predictive models all day. And indeed, we had our own predictive model in our team. It produced results. And of course, we also looked at views, for example. And we took those predictions and tried to sell it to the higher echelons in our organization. But honestly, we failed to build trust with the higher ranks. And we can only speculate why. I think one reason is that they were not sharp enough. The uncertainty was too high. So at some point, we discontinued this. So we stopped updating and communicating the results of our model. And instead, so we kind of left the prediction part out, and we, let's say, switched to an approach where we reduced our ambitions to get an accurate, up-to-date, but comprehensive situational picture. So instead of looking at the future and trying to predict the future, we then said it's enough for our organization to have the situation as it is right now. So maybe the initial thought, the initial goal of having like time series predictions of conflict was overconfident. That might change in the future with AI and maybe new approaches, new models. But at the moment, we have left the path of creating predictions.
Great, that's a very practical example. Aurora, what about from your
Yes,
side?
thank you. And actually, I can build a nice bridge to the misassumption I thought about presenting. Because, yeah, you mentioned that this rather high uncertainty led basically to the end of preview. And I would argue that one common misassumption is that more sophisticated models lead to better outcomes. So I think instead of like these increasingly complex analytical tools, we rather need simple and transparent tools that we can trust, that we can easily use. Of course, at the same time, we have to avoid oversimplifying things. So that's like a difficult balance to strike to on the one hand, capture the complexity of the reality we live in, but on the other hand, also provide tools that can be communicated appropriately. So I think this is a bit due to the gap between research academia on the one side and then policy institutions on the other side. So hence I think it's really good to have a space like this, a conference where we come together and exchange. And actually in our case, at the EAS and like in general in the EU context, we have the privilege of having a data team that we work very closely with, so a bit similar to the German MFA, where we are really basically almost on a daily basis in touch. And yeah, just to make this point that I think it should be like a dialogue on how kind of easy digestible tools should be on the one hand, and then still like correct and scientifically sound.
Yeah, really balancing between that, what's robust enough, but not too fancy or too sophisticated for the policymakers to grasp. Does that echo? Does that sound familiar, Fraser?
So thank you. I think is this microphone? Yes, we are on. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to pick up misconceptions and on a theme that's come across the last 2 days on decision makers or what are decision makers, and actually perhaps not misconceptions within this group, who I think over the last 2 days have demonstrated that they do understand it quite well. But let's sort of talk about a more general misconception and the idea of decision makers, and perhaps within government institutions, the idea that decision makers are a monolith, and they are absolutely not. Like, we are single representatives of quite large organizations. And I think we have to sort of be able to understand as a community that there's a very deep and varied set of institutional incentives and objectives, political ones as well, that the political ones inform the institutional ones and are often changing all the time with elections and other things going on, and sort of in response to the geopolitical moments. And what is needed, and we can pick up on this, I think, sort of later in the discussion, is to have, through our warning systems and methods, a set of pre-agreed options. These are things that are always going to be useful, because if you're just trying to influence a generic decision maker in a large institution, you're never going to be able to find the right point at the right moment. But yeah, maybe we can pick up on a bit of that later.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think earlier panels today were pointing to this same point about contextualizing to specific type of decision maker. Decision makers are clearly not a monolith, but how do you kind of do that work? Ollie?
Yeah, thanks. Just from the onset, I just want to say that absolutely a fantastic 2 days. I've learned a lot on amazing panels and talks. I don't know if it's a misconception, and I'm also echoing what my colleagues already said. Lack of information is not an issue, particularly when we just are flooded with so much stuff all the time. In fact, I would argue, and I'm thinking about the political masters, that less is more. And the most important point here, of course, is that the information that is coming in is precise, timely, and very concise, and it can be acted upon. And I think the misconception is there's often, whether there's a political will to act. And I would also argue that, at least in the European context, there's not a single state that is able to sort of alone take an agenda forward. Rather, we need sort of partnerships, and that's actually the issue. So the misconception, I think, here is whether there's actually the possibility to act upon many crises, because we're just flooded with situations out there.
And that very much echoes, I think, what Janni Lilja was saying yesterday about the need for actionable data, and that's what they are definitely thirsty for at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what you're saying. Great, well, we'll have a couple of misconceptions. Is there anything still that you would like to add, hearing each other? This is, or clarified, we move forward.
I think it's too easy to put all the blame on this decision maker. It's processes. We need to change the processes. At least in the Federal Foreign Office, everything is kind of decided within processes, and those processes are decades old. And they were designed decades ago, and they are text-based. So the information comes from our country departments, from the country units, from the consulates, and from the embassies all around the world. And then this information that is gathered at a very granular level climbs up the hierarchy, and it gets condensed, and condensed. And it's very difficult for us, at least that's my impression, to come into that process. So we are a small cogwheel in a large machinery, but we haven't gained that much attraction with our data products yet. What works really well is the simple products. That's what you just mentioned. Maps, single charts with some explanatory bullet points, not more than 1 to 3, one pages. That's what works and what's inquired in the Federal Foreign Office, what's requested and what our team delivers. But those complex products with the scientific background, like predictions, they haven't gained that much attraction, to be honest.
This is so nicely scripted. You just kind of brought it to the next question, which is really about kind of what is working. I mean, we will also talk about the challenges, but what is working? So you're saying it's simple products, very clear recommendations, not too complicated. Any other thoughts? Like, what have you learned as institutions? What has improved your ability to act or respond more effectively? Any other insights to share? What is actually working?
Yeah, so I think to pick up on this point I was making on sort of pre-agreed options, or to recognise where your thresholds are. So we've, in the team that I work in, we're in the middle of a restructure, because that's, you know, everyone's restructuring at the minute. But we are a team that focuses on disaster risk, humanitarian risk, conflict risk, and atrocity risk, a whole range of different things. And I think we've got the clearest examples of what works from the disaster risk element. There are clearer thresholds, same with some of the humanitarian responses as well. And that comes down to a lot of pre-preparation ahead of time when we are doing scenario building with the right group of stakeholders across government and with our partners. And then we're able to draw on that when the signal becomes strong enough that it crosses a threshold, and we're able to, you know, for example, put humanitarian aid, pre-deploy it, get it ready, be able to respond in a sort of timely fashion. So there's examples on sort of hurricane responses, which the UK preps every single year, because we've got territories in the Caribbean. And yeah, but it's this idea that we have thought about likely outcomes and likely decisions that might need to be made. We've had a discussion, we're able to draw back on those again. That is much harder to do, and I don't think we've got a perfect answer for this yet on conflict. And possibly on some of the atrocity risks as well. But I think that's one of the challenges. But you want examples, not challenges yet.
Yeah, hold on with the challenges. But so when the toolbox of response is also clear, is that essentially what you're saying? Yeah. So, yeah. Any other? Yeah, Aurora.
Yeah, maybe because processes were already mentioned. So I think they can also be something good. So for example, we have like an annual conflict prevention prioritization process. So on an annual basis, we select prevention priorities for the next year based on the data input that we get from our JRC colleagues. And then in the processes themselves, we rather have qualitative approaches. So our idea is for the selection, the prioritization, to use the input from the predictive models, and then work with more qualitative approaches in workshops with colleagues from the delegations, the Commission, member states, and so on. One thing we learned was to keep our like the final product, our action plans, really concise. So to have like really max 10 pages product at the end, because no one will read like a 40 pages report, or only the very interested colleagues. And to have like really concrete recommendations with like a clear pen holder, a clear timeline, so that really people know what to do and to also have like a monitoring process. So to see afterwards, okay, is this like indeed implemented, or is it just, yeah, will it get lost in the paper bin? Then maybe a second point, to see oneself as a bit of a like service provider. So in our, because we're more of an like horizontal unit, so to really adapt to the needs of especially delegations and geos, so the divisions working on particular countries or regions, so to really, yeah, make their life easier. Everyone has a full schedule, so to really yeah, provide an added value also for their daily work. And then last but not least, to, I mean, follow the famous EU integrated approach, so to really team up with Commission colleagues, FPI, INTPA, ECHO, to really make sure that the different instruments that we have at our disposal are coherent, come together, and yeah.
But what does that, just to follow up, what does that look like in practice? We've said many times that it's collaboration and how we work through silos. Like with this huge bureaucracy like the EU, what does that, how do you organize that collaboration in practical terms that it actually works?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically just like including everyone whose like, work will be affected in the workshops that we organize, in the consultation processes, on the action plans that we draft. And indeed, that's a lot of coordination work, I can tell you. So I think that's really, just a lot of our working time, but that's just, part of the job. And especially, of course, I think even more in the EU context compared to the national one. Of course, the institutional complexity is quite big. But yeah, it's important to do that.
But this is a really interesting, useful insight about the role of processes, especially in big institutions. And the processes can work against or for of if you have a standard process where you look at the data that is coming in and you assess priorities, and it's kind of like it's there. You don't have to at least come up with the process as something data emerges that is useful for you. I wonder if it would be then useful to think about some concrete examples. So, these are kind of general principles and what works, what doesn't. But if you, within your respective ministry, you've gotten some information that indicates, a warning, and there is a need to take early action. Can you give an example that, what happens, what practically happens? Information gets in where, Olli, you're coming in. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Happy to share an anecdote from real life, sort of a world of hard security, how data-informed analysis contributed to early action response. So just about 3 years ago, I was about to celebrate the midsummer, which is a big thing in Finland, I'm sure also in Sweden. It so happened that I was the senior duty officer at call at the ministry for that weekend. I mean, this is a function that the ministry has somebody, a senior level officer, tracking what's going on in the world that potentially has security implications for us in Finland. Okay, so it so happened that it was late in the Friday, midsummer was approaching, and I received a call from the government situation awareness room that something very strange is taking place in a city called Rostov of Donau, which is a city, a Russian city, southwest in Russia. I said, okay, this is very interesting. Keep me posted. And early next morning, Saturday, midsummer Saturday, the officer called that, okay, it appears that the Wagner group, that is the paramilitary company of the then Yevgeny Prigozhin, was amassing his troops. They had taken over some Russian army barracks and were about to set for a convoy towards Moscow. And I immediately realized, okay, this is pretty serious stuff and might have security implications for us. So I immediately called some senior colleagues at the ministry and also other government agencies that keep track of these kinds of issues when it's not office hours. So what we set up a sort of a task force ad hoc to keep a tab what's going on based on sort of real life feed. data that was coming in through different sources, and you know, really tracking what's going on. So it turned out actually, this is sort of in posterity. We know that Wagner and Prigozhin, also known as Putin's cook, had indeed staged a mutiny, and his convoy was on the way to Moscow. And it was kind of baffling for us because we thought that the Russian army, if they would wanted, they could have just taken out the convoy with an airstrike. So clearly, you know, there's something very strange going on. And we thought that, wait a minute, you know, if something really serious happens in the Russian sort of security world, and the whole thing implodes, it might have actually very serious security implications on our borders, and of course systems are in place and need to be activated in that case. So it turned out, luckily, towards the end of that Saturday, he decided to do an about face and bring the convoy back, not head towards Moscow. But anyway, so we sort of came up with this situation analysis, very, very brief, and it so happened that the President of the Republic then convened a meeting with high-ranking officials, and we presented, you know, what had happened on that day, and of course, you know, there's all kinds of stuff that's classified, but the point here is that it was real, you know, using real-life data and actually acting and then coming up with contingency plans. Thank God nothing happened. I mean, Prigozhin, I mean, I think he was shot down later from a plane. Some strange stuff within the Russian security circus. But anyway, so that's a good example of, you know, something, you know, acting on real life data. And the point here is that this is 3 years ago. So of course we have now moved on with the use of artificial intelligence in data gathering. So that would have been even more timely, you know, feed-in coming if this would happen this coming mid-summer celebration. So let's see.
Interesting, and also, I mean, all of these different factors that you may have a process of how you react to warning that is coming in, but that may also be affected by the context you are. If you're doing that in midsummer, it looks somewhat different than it does in another time. But and how would the speed of reaction be changing with AI and the type of information you would be getting in? Any other thoughts on, like, do you have practical examples of good examples or even good elements of an example that you'd like to share?
I have a more long-term example. So the Federal Foreign Office supports democracy building in countries all around the world, and it also supports democratic resilience. And we had a specific unit that was responsible for the projects that are supposed to support democracy building. And this unit approached us as data scientists and asked us for help because they wanted to make a data-driven decision about how to allocate funds to projects in the field of democracy building. And then we did this analysis using the VDEM dataset, and we tailored it to the specific needs and aspects that are relevant for the Federal Foreign Office, because we can only support certain aspects of democracy, like supporting the electoral process or supporting the jurisdictional system, things like that. So we have a limited toolbox, and the question was what country to support and what fields or what aspects of democracy to support, because we need to allocate funds. And then we did a very comprehensive analysis that was tailored to our needs. And here comes the downside. When it was finished, the problem was that the people we were working with in the other department rotated out to other countries, and all the knowledge was gone. So we still have that analysis. It needs to be updated, and we hope that we can repeat it next year. But this is definitely an issue. It's the loss of knowledge that comes with the rotation of the diplomatic personnel.
Yeah, I mean, we have contextual realities, we have institution realities, and how that may come and hinder process. Thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts on good practices. We always tilt towards the challenges, even if we start with the good. Anything that you've learned, like what has improved your ability for early action? Fraser.
I mean, there's another practical example. I mean, I mentioned sort of hurricane responses. We've got an example that we talk about from a humanitarian response cycle on a cyclone in Bangladesh in 2024, which is about that we've talked about collaboration, how we're making sure we're bringing people together. So making sure that we are working with our partners on the ground. That again, we've done this thing I talked about. We've done some scenarios. We've got some pre-agreed triggers and thresholds, and some pre-agreed actions. Importantly, when those are met. And so in that example, we coordinating a sort of larger response, were able to get, I think, access to 150,000 people within 24 hours of that trigger being, that threshold being met, and that action started. And that's a day or so ahead of the landfall of the cyclone. We're able to get a mixture of things in, so like water sanitation support, cash transfers, and then evacuation support where it's necessary. So, again, I mean, I'm a conflict person, but you know, and the conflict bit is hard. But I think from a humanitarian side, we've got good examples of making sure those systems are in place and robust in order to achieve the objectives.
But that's really interesting, and also how much more learning there could be then from the humanitarian sector to also conflict and security sector. Well, let's move and talk about then kind of like where still the sticking points are in order to really have an effective response also our field when it comes to from warning to action. And we also want to bring the audience in. So we start with the poll first that we will also invite you to comment on. And the question is, what is currently the biggest obstacle preventing early warning from translating into preventive action? It's a big question, but it's just to get a sense of where the room is. If you can, we will get a Menti showing in a while. Do you want to? Yes, if you can just, there are a couple of options, and I will ask you afterwards if there's something clearly missing. There may well be, so don't be alarmed, but just respond what you think is closest, or at least would be important to work on. So the options here that we have put is this ominous lack of political will, insufficient funding for prevention, weak institutional coordination, information overload, so that there are too many warnings, it's difficult to prioritize, a lack of trust in data and evidence, difficulty identifying effective responses. I think that was also mentioned yesterday by Annie. Like, you want to respond, but what is the response, or what it could be? Limited local ownership and participation. So actually, then we also always perhaps look towards responses in other places. Lack of political will leading, clearly. Perhaps not a shocking surprise. I think that has been mentioned a few times in the course of this conference. But quite a pretty even spread otherwise. It's interesting that it goes actually in the number of priorities. No, now it's changing. Okay, good. I was wondering that there was a bias in the setup of the survey, but lack of political will, that seems to be the biggest obstacle, staying there on top. Insufficient funding, weak as responses are coming in. What would you say? What would be the biggest obstacle?
Well,
Olli?
I can kick off. Political will, yeah, but I would also argue that there are political considerations because, countries, states, in the case of Finland, need to balance national interests with other foreign policy goals and objectives. So, okay, when you think about a humanitarian crisis, it's easier to, muster will, and it's sort of somehow in this day and age more palatable to actually raise funds and support. As contrasting to the idea, if you recall the R2P, world, the responsibility to protect and all of that, and then we had Afghanistan, we had Iraq, and the whole idea of, interventions. I mean, what is a foreign intervention, and should it be even done? Based particularly on Afghanistan. I served a couple of tours in Afghanistan myself, so been there, done that. So there are these things to balance and consider, and they act also as sort of brakes, I would say, in many instances.
So it's not necessary there's completely a lack of political will, but there are just competing priorities and what is actually feasible from decision makers' perspective. Fraser, you're nodding.
I mean, I don't want to duck the point. I mean, there is definitely a lack of political will in some circumstances in terms of government response not being brave enough, right? And I think that's important in a number of circumstances. But there's more underneath it, and I think it goes to the second one on sort of weak institutional coordination. It is, Yanni mentioned this yesterday. We've talked about it a bit. I think Guy mentioned it on the very first panel. Guy from the JRC, and it's come up already here. There are such a large number of competing priorities going on all the time. Like, it's not that the institutions are failing to make decisions, it's that they are taking hundreds, thousands of decisions every single day, and a lot of them are in sort of are in competition with each other. So there's a sort of prioritization aspect within those different decisions to make sure you can get the right decision to the right person at the right time. So that's an element of it, and I don't, as I say, intend that to duck the fact around some element of that lack of political will is lack of political bravery, which I think is definitely true in some circumstances, particularly around atrocity prevention. The weak institutional coordination, I think, would be certainly descriptive of some elements of the way that we come up with decisions at the end of processes, or lack of decisions. Though I don't necessarily. I mean, there's a sort of the way that's phrased is sort of an implicit kind of value judgment, like they're just not trying hard enough. I think again, it's quite complex. But having processes in place that we know have worked. So again, the humanitarian examples that I gave earlier on around coming up with pre-agreed thresholds and actions and so on, and trying to take those approaches, systems, processes, and apply them to conflict context or atrocity context is something that we are very cognizant of and certainly trying to do. I could comment on some of the others, but I'll stop for a second.
Yeah, coming back to also the point Marius raised earlier about processes, I do want to bring the audience in. So if you have a reflection about this question, you would like to add a category that wasn't there, you would like to ask a question about the obstacles to the panel, feel free to do so. And while I'll give you a minute to think about, I'll also give a floor to Aurora and Marius to comment on this. Where do you sit in the EU system? Where do you find to be the biggest obstacle?
I mean, yeah, as mentioned before, I think the institutional complexity in the EU context is, of course, like an even bigger topic than at the national level, and also where, we don't have one decision maker, right? Using this term again. But yeah, I would have also mentioned just the prevalence of already ongoing crises, and also like the pacing that we see in media coverage nowadays that becomes faster and faster. And I think it's maybe even like also more like societal topic, so that we all have to reflect on if we really always want to run like after the next crisis. So I think it's a bit more of a general phenomenon as well.
And I think that they're difficult trade-offs. I was yesterday thinking, when we look at the different country responses, and on the basis of the analysis, for example, Afghanistan would not merit an early action, like it wouldn't merit action. So because there wasn't anything immediately happening, it was more the structural challenges that there wasn't a spike in a sudden change. So would that mean that it wouldn't merit support or action from the international community or from the EU because it doesn't show up in the same way as a spike? So I think these are these trade-offs that certainly are battled with. So Marius, go ahead.
Lack of political will, I don't agree on that concerning Germany, because Germany currently focuses strongly on the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, and this absorbs a lot of resources and attention. And this is also reflected in the restructuring that we are undergoing. Until 2 weeks ago, we had the Department for Stabilization, Humanitarian Aid, Peacekeeping, and so on. And this department has been basically dismantled. And our team as a whole got transferred to a new department called Security Foreign Policy. And our subunit will be called Current Threats. And this somehow reflects a change in German foreign policy with a stronger tendency toward hard security policy. And I think it's not a question of political will. I mean, everybody would agree that it's worth supporting, or let's say that to intervene somehow or to support peace building in any country on earth, but it's clearly a matter of prioritization. I mean, the conflict in Ukraine is pretty close to Germany. We have a lot of refugees. We are one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine. And that's how it is. We don't have infinite money. We don't have infinite resources. So there is a prioritization.
I'll just chip in and echo exactly what you're saying. And not only in the case of Finland, but I think many other European states. And yet we are cognizant that there's Sudan, there's Myanmar, there's many important crises where people are actually really suffering. But again, the focus now in Europe is very much on the Ukraine-Russia file, hard security issues. And that's kind of sad in the way that it's away from ODA and all, this.
Oh. Yeah. Fraser, quick comment and then turning to the audience. Yeah.
Okay, maybe just to say that I think all of these are solvable problems, right? So I think that's an important thing to recognize. I actually think, I assume everyone's had to rank these. That's why there is some against lack of trust in data and evidence. But there's quite a lot of trust that we've got institutionally against those in the room and the organizations you're representing. We can address all of these bits, all right? I mean, we can deal with too many warnings, which is definitely a problem, by getting better at prioritizing. We can get better at identifying effective responses by practicing it and by doing it in practice and then learning what works. And we can address the lack of institutional coordination and the lack of political will, I think, by keeping working at it and working in partnership with everybody here.
Well, thank you. That's a really important point as well, and the optimism that is there, and that takes the commitment and will.
That's all of my optimism for the moment.
Okay, good to know you've run out. Any questions, comments from the audience? At least I see one there and one here. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. And if you can share your name as well, and before your reflection.
John Church. Thank you. I was wondering if you actually had any, however anecdotal, positive examples of where an intervention went very well due to early warning data, and maybe like what you would draw from those examples as like what we should be doing more of.
Great, thank you. More positive examples. Let's take a couple of questions, so also give you some time to think. Yeah.
Thanks, Lawrence Wucher. Picking up on the comments about the need to balance the sophistication of the analysis with the simplicity, can you talk a little bit about what you think key policymakers really need to know and understand about quantitative analyses? It's probably not the details of the methodology that the data scientists understand, but it's something about that, the data, the methodology, the quality of the analysis. What exactly is the most important thing so they will then trust and be able to act on those analyses?
What do policymakers need to know about methodology behind? Yes, please.
You asked the question about what else would we add to the list. I think your comment was getting at under the institutional coordination, maybe as part of it. I don't know if your countries have this, but spent 9 years at State Department until last year, did atrocity prevention with Lawrence, so he's very familiar that I would always tell him that the regional functional divide is a much bigger problem that I feel like outside of government, nobody really understands that, but it gets to the points, some of the comments that you made about the embassy or whoever's in charge of the country. When we're talking about an action, the human rights people are the lowest on the totem pole in those interagency conversations, and that whoever's in charge of policy for that country usually ends up winning out. So I think that without solving that regional functional divide, we're never going to get over to actually doing human rights. And then the only other two that I'd add, just to see what you think, is policy coherence. I think there's a lot of overlapping agendas that are related but some tangentially, and we tried to start kind of bucketing. For example, when the Global Fragility Act was signed, we put atrocity prevention, women, peace and security, and stabilization underneath, thinking that would make it more coherent to have these stakeholders working together, but I think it diluted a lot of key concepts. And then the last one is, I think strategic communications, like we also have to do better messaging to our domestic stakeholders and taxpayers about why intervening in this country has anything to do with you, right? And just making sure that there's not only the moral objective, but the strategic imperative.
Excellent, thank you very much, and also kind of bringing a bit more nuance to these broad categories. So I think that there was a question about good examples, a thirst for more of those. Second, about methodology, what the policymakers need to know, and then these are like really potential pain points within institutions, the divide between functional and geographic teams, the need for strategic communications and policy coherence. Do you want to comment on this?
I'd say Lawrence is one of them. I'm going to skirt around the positive examples. I feel like I'm out of positive examples. I think, yeah, what do decision makers or policy makers need to know? I think that the source that this is coming from is credible, which I think broadly it is in these instances, in terms of the institutions that. The data production institutions, you guys, that we are taking, and then us, hopefully we're credible within our own organizations putting them up. But also around the clarity, this kind of goes to the institutional coordination point on the Menti, like who is actually responsible for the decision that's being taken, which is maybe obvious, but is often quite hard when situations are quite dynamic. And so that, again, there's not an easy solution to that, but it's just constantly being aware that you need to have clear ownership for certain decisions all the way through. And I think that goes to part of the question around policy coherence. Yeah, I would absolutely recognize the fact that often it's the loudest voices that will win out. And there's these are incredibly, certainly speaking for the UK, we're working in an incredibly hierarchical organization, right? So there's an awful lot of that comes into play, but also not to avoid the fact that you might see from the outside a single decision or a lack of a single decision. There are a tremendous amount of disagreements going on under the surface. So there are good people within the system trying to get to the answer that you think needs to happen. And maybe I can pick up on this later, but I think there's a bit to pick up on from the previous panel that Simon mentioned. A few other people have mentioned it, and I've talked in the breaks to a few people. There is something around the community here maybe looking at doing more advocacy, I think. And I know that'll be uncomfortable for a lot of people, but that's one way that you can see the warnings that you are flagging up having an effect, which is to sort of keep the pressure on us, because there will be advocates within the organization for you. You just need to keep adding the pressure on us so that we can support you on it.
The point about strategic communication. Aurora was coming in, and then I'll give Olli.
If that's okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, good. No, maybe I would be able to chip in another positive example.
Cool.
So actually we offer like a certain kind of tool set to our colleagues for our analysis, so for the strategic processes that we do. And one of them focuses on electoral violence, and we've really seen that these processes have been like really popular among colleagues. So I think violence around an election is something like really concrete and something like really easy to grasp. I mean, of course, it's also based on data, the selection we do in this field. Like, I mean, obviously looking at past elections and whether there were instances of increased violence in the past, because that's obviously the best indicator for future violence around elections. And then we carry out these processes approximately 2 years before an election takes place, so that we have enough time to then implement instruments. And these are really analyses where we've been like really often able to mobilize rapid actions in cooperation with foreign policy instruments, or with our EU colleagues from FPI. And so maybe this for the positive examples question. And then for the trust in tools, I would have also definitely mentioned the data sources. And then maybe to also, like when it comes to models, to really have clear dependent variables. So to really use terms that policymakers also understand. So for example, in our tools, we talk about probability and intensity. And I think that's something every one of us can understand, right? What it means. And I think we should also not underestimate. I mean, of course, data literacy in these institutions is definitely an issue and a challenge, but I think we should also not underestimate colleagues. I think they tend to really ask the right questions and really want to understand what these models are based on. So I think that was a really good question.
Great.
I just wanted to add to the second question that indeed, when you think about senior level officials and more importantly, political masters, be it in the national parliament or European Parliament, I think they take it for granted and of course expect that all the analysis is based on evidence-based research. But very importantly, when you think about politicians in particular, I mean, they deal with a plethora of issues. So it's like an A4, very clear, crisp, with 3 points that are sort of understandable for a person who is not, day-to-day dealing with a particular file. So Stratcom, communication, you can never be clear enough. I think that's the lesson that I have learned in my career, dealing with political masters.
And then one further example from the GFFO, we think that funding science and funding data early warning projects is very valuable, and we do that. We are the largest donor in the CRAFT, the Complex Risk Analytics Fund. We also funded the Climate Conflict Vulnerability Index project that you can find online, and we keep on supporting such projects.
Well, yeah, that's also important, the long-term investments that are done in order to this crucial infrastructure to keep it going. And maybe, again, using your point as a segue to talking about, okay, then if we see it's not perfect, there are some good progress, there are good practices that have taken place, but it's still a lot of work that needs to be done in order to enhance early action. So now I want to kind of discuss that a little bit more and also hear from you. What is it that we should prioritize? So the next question is kind of like, if we think about what are the priorities in order to strengthen preventive action over the, let's say, next 5 years, where would you invest in? So now I will give you $100 million just because I'm very generous and you can allocate it in between these categories. It's a lot of money, but when it's imaginary money, that's easy to do. Where would you actually invest if we want to strengthen early action? You can take some time, and as the audience is doing their allocations, I'm going to turn to the panel to start reflecting on theirs. Where would you put? And again, these categories may not be perfect. There is, is a category about really still working on community engagement platforms, having rapid response mechanisms that are kind of allocated specific instruments to react quickly, decision support for policymakers, community data collection and monitoring, learning and evaluation, or improving forecasting and predictive analytics. Any thoughts?
Maybe it chimes a bit with where we're going to on these responses. I think it's something if you gave me €100 million, what would I do with it? Wow.
Wow.
Convert it into pounds sterling to start with. I think there's something definitely around not investing less money, but in thinking about investing money in systems rather than tools. And I think that's probably the first bit I go, which I think is maybe these community engagement platforms, possibly the rapid response mechanisms as well. And that is not just creating more and more individual tools, but thinking about how they work together, how they work with, as I've said already a few times, pre-agreed sort of thresholds and action points, because these are the bits that need to happen if the decision is going to be taken. So yeah, a lot more time and money on that. Maybe not the whole 100 million, but yeah.
Thank you.
I would actually think slightly out of the box in terms of these choices. And I was thinking about, partnerships, because you see, I think we very much are in the world of the OECD, the donor community, mostly the Western world, and reaching out and strengthening partnerships with the emerging rising powers, Qatar, Turkey, Saudis and others that also have, clout in their respective spheres where they work. So having that partnership, I think, is very important, that we don't lose sight and be in our own, I don't know if the bubble is the right term, but anyway, so just reaching out, and maybe it's not so much a question of, money, it's very much about just strengthening and deepening those partnerships. With sometimes, actors that we don't necessarily always share the values, but I mean, 100%, but nonetheless need to sort of work in concert.
Yeah, recognizing that different actors have different mandates or authorities in certain
strengths.
areas and strengths in order to act. So it might be community engagement platforms or then other state-based actors. Turning to the audience, what is missing from the categories? Where do you want to share where you did your investments? Do you have any reflections, questions? I see from the eyes of people that we are really getting to the end of the conference, but still going strong. There's tough decisions to be made before we conclude. Yes, please.
Amy from George Washington University. I also worked at the State Department previously at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, which no longer exists. But that office did have what was called a negotiation support unit, and they were focused on mediation support. And so I guess if I had 100 million euros, some of it I would want to go to mediation support and more inclusive mediation efforts, which perhaps is included under community engagement, but it's not explicit, and we haven't talked a lot about inclusion here, and given that Sweden did play an important role in that historically in terms of its feminist foreign policy, I think that's worth also highlighting, but curious to hear your thoughts.
Great. That's a really, really important and practical point. Any other? Yes, please.
Hi, Heidi Ober with Tetra Tech. I guess one of the questions I had was, what do you, and this is to the group, what is decision support for policymakers? So I think, is that more data? I think we've talked a bit about lots of data. Is it the 3 bullet points? Is it facilitating thinking, planning workshops? Is it just money? So it'd be good to hear from you what would be best for decision support.
Excellent question. Well, what kind of support then would be useful to decision makers? I think it seems that that would be allocated some funds. How would you use that?
I can kick off again. So, I mean, yes, I mean, we haven't really talked about how our institutions are functioning, because that's not the, how our institutions are structured, because that's not the point of the panel, but a lot of love for CSO. We're very sad to see a number of friends and colleagues lose their jobs last year. As with CSO, the way the UK teams are structured, the risk work, the data analytics work, all of that is tied up with alongside preparedness teams and mediation teams and sort of the responsive tools. So very much working in that sort of close partnership. So absolutely, I agree with you that there's not a huge amount of point in doing them in silos, right? Then one needs to lead to the other. Maybe that's an obvious point, but I would agree. What do decision makers need support for policymakers? Sorry, probably not more data. I mean, good data, definitely, but I think at the minute they're already very swamped. Something about data literacy. I may be sort of outing myself. I'm not a data analyst. I'm a policy person and a conflict policy person at that. I think I'm relatively representative of my organization in that I'm a social scientist. I'm not a sort of numbers stats person, and that's a problem if the information that you're giving us is based on quantitative data. So there's a big bit on making sure that people can understand and genuinely do understand the information that they're being given, and that's not always the same thing. People are very ready to sort of say, yeah, get that, okay, let's take a decision on that. That goes to the point that Guy made on the very first panel around you can spend a bit of time with diplomats, training them up. This is how you understand this particular risk or this warning or what this statistic or this trend line means, and it doesn't mean that, it definitely means this thing. And then they move on to a different posting. I mean, that's the nature of the diplomatic service, so you're going to have to invest in that as a priority, I think. And then the other bits, I've written down workshop and then something else I can't read. Yeah, workshops and processes to make sure that you're understanding the information that you've got and that you're pre-planning, again, triggers, thresholds, actions.
Great. I want to also turn to audience if there were 3 comments that I see or questions, 2 on that side and 1 on that side. And we'll take those as a last round. Wait, there's a lag.
I was just waiting for a difficult question from Kathy. That's fine.
Censored.
Is that one on? No.
Okay.
Okay.
Cooperation.
If I might slightly disagree with Fraser. So I'm biased because I'm from a data collection organization, but I feel like if I were to, data collection's expensive, and I think good data collection is even more expensive than that. And I would agree that I don't think we need more data in the sense that, we need yet another organization maybe collecting information about the same thing. But I do think we need investments for improving the data that we do have. So I'm thinking, obviously, from a conflict data perspective, there's always more we can do to collect things in a more timely manner, to make it more accessible and available for people, et cetera. There's ways that we can improve the data by having people on the ground, for example, which is much more expensive than, getting information from the news. But I'm also thinking about, like displacement data, things where it involves people very much being on the ground, being able to go and be in the places where those things are happening to collect information. So I would say, yeah, maybe not more types of data necessarily, but more investment in improving the data collection that we already have started building on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. I very much agree with what you just said and what Guy said in the first panel. And I think it's a great idea to have more education, and as I just said in the panel, more kind of communication across different kind of fields and levels. So my question is, who should fund this, and is it craft?
Perfect. And the last question there.
Hello. My question is getting a little bit towards what you as policymakers and people with influence in your respective government agencies would take community engagement platforms to mean. I know we've spoken a lot about different ways of getting information to and from communities, particularly in disasters and hazard times, but one thing that we know particularly from COVID and previous disasters is that often those community organizations were there long before this particular event occurred, and with funding changes throughout the world and a lot of funding decline, we are seeing a lot less of those organizations being able to continue on with their daily operations, to have that trust and network established at the time. So I wonder for you, when you're looking at community engagement, are you, obviously the question is around data-driven conflict prevention and preventative work. For you, what is that meaning within your respective agencies? And what does community engagement look like both in advance and creating that system so that when the time comes to need it, there is an existing infrastructure to be able to draw on? Thank you.
Elaborating a little bit. Fraser,
Can I take the first two directed at me? I violently agree with Katty, and she's definitely improved my response. Yes, not no more data, but better data. And I think it's particularly true of ACLED, and we haven't had this conversation yet, but I think there's something very interesting about when we are seeing a sort of general reduction in sort of media freedom and journalistic sort of standards, and the sources on which you can draw on quantitatively, scraping and otherwise, and therefore the need to bolster that. So if we're seeing a sort of democratic retreat in everything else, and we've only got 2 minutes, so I won't go into too much detail, but absolutely funding things that go against that, right? Data literacy should be funded by craft. Yes, I think it should be funded by craft. But also, we should be funding this internally ourselves. Like, it's a responsibility that we have as the institutions to educate our own staff. So not just craft, but sure, why not?
Perfect. I think we are coming to the end of the panel. So was there still a last response that there was about the community engagement, and any elaboration of that, what that could look like?
I think maybe a bit tricky for us to answer because we are all headquarters people, at least now. I don't know, Ollie, if you You wanna?
Can't really.
Maybe we'll continue that over the coffee break or in the community engagement that this community will continue to have. Last words, very like 15 seconds. If you were to prioritize one action in order to strengthen early action based on early warnings, what would that be? No explanations, just one sentence. Marius.
I would make sure that data-driven results become an integral part of the processes in the decision making.
Great. Processes. Aurora.
Maybe to mention an aspect we haven't discussed yet, to link early warning units to really the highest management levels in our institutions. I think that's something we haven't touched upon yet. I think this could also help because indeed processes matter and often it's rather top down than bottom up. So I think this could also help.
Direct access of early warning units to the leadership, top leadership.
I would encourage you all, as I've said already, to be advocates for what the reason that you're doing this work. I think Alex this morning mentioned at the end of the panel, potentially getting away from being sterile truth tellers to being convincing storytellers, and I think that is worth considering. This conference is Data for Peace, and there are plenty of people who do not want peace, so you need to stand up and do it. So yeah, that would be my point.
Yeah, I mean, today's technology is sort of outdated tomorrow, so it's not about technology or tools, it's investment in human resources and their ability to use whatever tools are available at the given time.
Wonderful. Just for my part, I really want to thank you, the panel, for the willingness to spell some institutional beans of really what is actually enabling or hindering early action. Maybe last thought from my side, I think Lauren was yesterday pointing to this saying of like, when there is a will, there's a way, but we should sometimes think it the other way, that if there is a way, perhaps there would be a will. And I think this panel was also pointing that maybe we also need more data of what actually works in order to strengthen early action based on early warning. But thank you, and please join me in giving a great round of applause to our panelists.